Well, happy Monday morning to you, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. I had a very relaxing weekend. Got to go to an automotive swap meet again. This is the time of the year when the automotive swap meets take place. I have to admit this. I'm pretty much addicted to swap meets. I just absolutely love to go to swap meets and look through all the rusty, crusty old parts and pick up some stuff for the cars I'm restoring and what have you. It's just in my blood. I think I've got rust in my veins or something like that. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. This is video number 66 in our study of 1 Corinthians 15, our thematic study. We've been focusing on the fact that in 1 Corinthians 15, 29 and following, right there in the midst of Paul's discussion of the resurrection, 3 times he refers to the suffering, the martyrdom, if you please, that he, and obviously the rest of the church at that time, was experiencing. Now, I have already suggested to you, and let me reiterate how incredibly important this is. And I developed this in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings, and in my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2. Folks, it is impossible to overemphasize the importance of the motif of martyr vindication in the discussion of eschatology. Why does Paul 3 times mention his suffering, his martyrdom? Was he just throwing it out there? No, it is because Paul very well knew that Jesus had said, Matthew chapter 23, that the measure of Israel's sin in persecuting the righteous. And when we conflate Matthew 23 with Luke 11, 49 and following, where Jesus said, I'm going to send to you apostles, prophets, wise men. Some of them you shall scourge, some of them you shall crucify. You shall chase from city to city, that upon you may come all of the righteous blood of all the righteous, from righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all of these things will come upon this generation. Here is Jesus saying that the killing of the apostles would fill up the measure of Israel's sin, fill up the measure of the righteous suffering. And do not forget, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 9, I think, and that means I calculate, I determine through logical process that God has set forth us, the apostles, last of all as men destined to die. Now look, folks, we know that there have been thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Christians who have died since the apostles. But Paul was not delusional. He was not wrong. He was not misled. He knew that the eschatological measure of sin and suffering was to be filled up in the suffering of the apostles and in the first century context. Now, watch this. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the resurrection set within the context of the suffering of the apostles, right? Well, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul said, writing to the Thessalonian church 2,000 years ago, he said, I thank God for your patience and your love and your patience in the midst of your tribulation, which is an evident sign of the coming judgment against your persecutors. For it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you, and to give to you who are being troubled relief, rest, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. Now watch this. 1 Corinthians 15 is the resurrection set in the context of the sufferings of Christ. Paul's sufferings as an apostle, as one of those determined as the last to die before the resurrection. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul is writing to his contemporaries saying they were being persecuted. Now watch this. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16, he said it was the Jews, the countrymen of the Thessalonians, and Acts chapter 17 confirms this. It was the Jews persecuting them, initiating that persecution, and watch that, catch the power of this. They had killed the prophets. They have now killed Jesus. They are now killing the apostles and the prophets of Jesus. And in doing so, they were filling up the measure of their sin, and judgment was about to fall on them. Do you catch that? So here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, in the midst of that persecution, Paul promised the Thessalonians, being persecuted for their faith, that they, not a church 2,000 years removed from them, but that they, the living, breathing, suffering Thessalonian church, they would receive relief from that persecution, quote, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. Well, wait a minute. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is the coming of the Lord for the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. The suffering of Paul was filling up the measure of suffering. They were the last to die, the apostles were, before the judgment and the resurrection. And here is Paul writing to the Thessalonians saying that the Jews were persecuting the apostles and prophets, filling up the measure of their sin. And he promised the Thessalonians, guess what? In other words, when that measure of suffering was filled up, but they, not some future unknown generation, but that they would receive relief from that then ongoing persecution, quote, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. Folks, this is emphatic, explicit declaration that the coming of the Lord in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, which is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, would occur in the lifetime of the first century Christians, the Thessalonians. This is inescapable. Unless you can divorce Paul's reference to his suffering from the eschatological measure of suffering and sin, unless you can divorce that from 1 Corinthians 15, which you can't, and unless you can divorce that suffering from the filling up of the measure of suffering and sin in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, and unless you can divorce that from 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and the then present suffering to fill up the measure of suffering, unless you can separate that from the coming of the Lord, I'm sorry, this proves beyond a shadow of a doubt the resurrection occurred at the day of the Lord in the first century. Hey, thanks so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. And I know I said I'd, try to close this real soon. I got to talk about Revelation at least a little bit, don't I? Okay, we'll talk about 1 Corinthians 15, the sufferings of Christ, and the book of Revelation. On the flip side, we'll see you there.